Huge fan. Huge fan.
Would you like to have your photo taken?
Can we get a family picture? Come on, you guys. Get a family picture. There you go.
Nice to have you, girl. Cheesy grin.
Smile.
Another cheesy grin.
All the great scientists, and this is one of them. Kepler and Galileo, Newton. Yeah, we got one right here. It's fantastic, amazing.
My name is Stephen Hawking. For the past 50 years, I have traveled the world, studying and lecturing about time and space, and the laws that govern the universe.
Stephen, break a leg. Don't say that. I'll have to look after him.
This film is a personal journey through my life, told in my own words. Come with me, and I will show you how I live and work today, and tell you the story of how I became who I am. Welcome to my world.
So you're going to take your lunch in the cafeteria? It's up to you.
Yes.
I just have to give Judith a call.
I think it would kill him if he was in a home being cared for by nurses. I think that would be the end for him. He likes to be able to choose what he wants to do with his life. He loves the danger of flying. He wants to go into space, and he's been in submarines. He's just the most craziest man. He's got a lot of guts in him. Just through here is the nurse's room. So if anything medical happens, we'll just grab a phone 999. But there is not much we can actually do because Stephen is on a nippy, which he'll breathe on. If that fails, the only other thing we could do, and we do have, we have oxygen cylinders, and we can give him oxygen. But if he's in total state, then we will have to let him go.
I have lived over 2/3 of my life with the threat of death hanging over me. Because every new day could be my last, I have developed a desire to make the most of each and every minute. Although I'm 71 now, I still go to work every day at Cambridge University.
I'll see you in a bit. Enjoy shopping.
Keeping an active mind has been vital to my survival, as has been maintaining a sense of humor.
When I went to my job interview, I thought he was going to ask me about my past medical history and what I've done before in care. but he didn't. He asked whether I could cook poached eggs. And I was 19 at the time, and I lied because I didn't know how to cook poached eggs, but I got the job straight away. We're not going to work anymore. It's like just going to go and see a friend. Well, family. Stephen's been there through the years of me growing up and like turning into an adult. So he's been there through most of the important stages of my life. I've had a very privileged life, thanks to Stephen. Do you enjoy my company?
Maybe.
You're horrible to me, ain't you?
Yes. As you can see, the gradual advance of my illness has meant that I am totally reliant on those around me. 71 years ago, life started that way too. I was born in 1942, exactly 300 years after the death of Galileo. My parents were both at Oxford University, where my father studied medicine. He later specialized in tropical diseases. It is often said that a person's early years are a good indication of how they will turn out. Perhaps my eldest sister Mary remembers me best.
I remember Stephen was very bright, always into things. I remember my father made me a doll's house, so Stephen put in both plumbing and lighting. He liked to win. He liked to win in everything. We all learnt to play drafts. I beat Stephen once at drafts, and he immediately took up chess, and I never beat him at that again.
I also spent a lot of time playing on my own as a boy. I had a passion to understand how things worked, from toy trains to the whole universe.
He would spend a lot of time looking at the sky, looking at the stars, and wondering where eternity came to an end. He couldn't conceive that there could be something without a finish.
Home life was always stimulating for me and my siblings. My mother and father were intellectuals, and naturally they expected their children to follow.
Both my parents were moving in the Highgate, Hampstead intelligentsia, that sort of circle. We always talked. Everyone talked and everybody argued. We used to argue theology a lot. It's a great thing for kids because you don't need any facts whatsoever.
To outsiders, the Hawking household was considered eccentric. But for me, it was a place where my mind was constantly challenged.
There were books everywhere, bookshelves that were double-banked, bookshelves that had, on top of the upright books, rows of other books shoehorned in wherever there was space. It was a less conventional house, one in which the children had a great deal of freedom, and I remember being quite gobsmacked by the conversation over lunch. It was about subjects which were never talked about in my house: sex, homosexuality, arguments for and against abortion, and various other subjects that were quite unusual.
As I developed into a teenager, my parents taught me to always question things and think big.
Stephen devised, and remember this was in the early 1950s, not just one but two computers, which we built from scratch. It was about the size of a half-depth fridge, but about as tall and about as wide. It solved logical problems posed in binary. If this condition is true and that condition is true, or that condition instead is true, then, and it would give you what the then meant.
At school, my classmates gave me the nickname Einstein, even though I was only ever halfway up the class. It was, I like to think, a very bright class.
It was always assumed Stephen would go to Oxford. Both my parents had been to Oxford. You know, he was extremely bright, there was never any doubt about this. He and my father had a difference of opinion about what he should study. Father thought it would be a good thing if Stephen did medicine, but Stephen was not into medicine. He'd have made the most awful doctor, I was thinking. So they compromised.
We agreed on a degree in natural sciences, specializing in physics. The prevailing attitude at Oxford at the time was very anti-work. You were supposed to be brilliant without effort, or to accept your limitations and get a fourth-class degree. To work hard to get a better class of degree was regarded as the mark of a grey man, the worst epithet in the Oxford vocabulary.
I think Steve and I fell, both of us, right into that category, that there was no need to work or appear to work. And Steve was a very funny guy. He was able to appreciate jokes and tell jokes the whole time. And spontaneous humor was really his forte.
At Oxford, I joined the rowing club and became a cox. I relished in the freedom, the speed, and of course, calling the shots. The rowing club also introduced me to one of my favorite pastimes at Oxford. Partying. I once calculated that I did about 1,000 hours work in the 3 years I was there, an average of an hour a day. I'm not proud of this lack of work. I'm just describing my attitude at the time, which I shared with most of my fellow students.
Within the whole year, people gradually thought of Steve as being the brilliant guy in the year. But he was brilliant in the sense that he could make off-the-cuff remarks, which were deep. So he was definitely a standout person of intellect. The question always was whether he would use that intellect to go anywhere.
Tonight, I am guest of honor at the launch of a supercomputer called Cosmos in Cambridge. Cosmos is one of the most powerful computers in the world, and will enable us to better understand our place in the universe. The notion of fame is a curious thing to me. In my mind, I am a scientist who has been lucky to work on some of the fundamental mysteries of our universe. Sometimes I wonder if I am as famous for my wheelchair and disabilities as I am for my discoveries. As my student days were in full swing, I was gradually becoming aware that all was not well. During my final year at Oxford, I had noticed that I was getting rather clumsy in my movements, and I fell over once or twice for no apparent reason. But then one evening, late at night, something more serious happened.
I recall the time that Steve fell down the stairs. He fell downstairs all the way to the bottom. He lost consciousness, and then he couldn't remember who he was. He couldn't remember where he was, so it was a very serious thing.
When I look back at that fall, I didn't realize at the time it was a warning sign of things to come. But I recovered and soon had more pressing things on my mind. Despite my relaxed attitude to study, I graduated with first-class honors and left Oxford for Cambridge University to begin my PhD. Yet, little did I know, I would soon be diagnosed with a crippling illness that would change my life forever.
Well, Stephen's speed of communication has very gradually slowed down. A few years ago, he was still able to use his hand switch and able to communicate by clicking this switch on his wheelchair. When he wasn't able to do that anymore, we switched over to a switch that he mounted on his cheek. But with him slowing down with that, we've approached his sponsors, and so they've been looking into facial recognition.
This is a high-speed camera which will allow us to see very fine details on the facial expressions, and this will help us to improve the rate of your speech and input.
I have had to learn to live with my slow rate of communication. I can only write by flinching my cheek muscle to move the cursor on my computer. One day I fear this muscle will fail, but I would like to be able to speak more quickly.
Do you want me to change it to English alphabetic? Yeah, I'm buzzing. Yeah. No. Is that all okay, Stephen? Yeah. I'm not getting this at all, Stephen. Sometimes he can make a mistake, and then he deletes it, and then he makes another mistake and deletes it, and it can be frustrating there watching, and he can see the frustration on his face as well.
I am hoping this current generation of software experts can harness what little movement I have left in my face and turn it into faster communication.
Your current piece of software is a little dated. Well, it's a lot dated, but you're very used to using it. So we've changed the method by which your next word prediction works, and it can pretty much pick up the correct word every single time, even if you're letters away from it.
This is a big improvement over the previous version. I really like it.
That's pretty amazing there.
I think it's actually gone brilliantly. The stuff that we showed him, he was excited about. Anything better than what he's doing, I think, is going to be a success. And anything that doesn't complicate Stephen's life any more than it is, I think that will be a success as well.
ATP 120, thank you very much. In 1962, age 20, when I arrived at Cambridge to begin my PhD, I was also desperate for my voice to be heard as I embarked on my first real scientific challenge. At the time, two theories battled to correctly describe the universe. The steady-state theory held that the universe had always existed and would exist forever. But there was another, more exciting idea. The Big Bang theory suggested that the universe had begun with a huge explosion. I decided to try to see if I could shed any light on how the Big Bang came to be. But by now, the immediate challenge I was facing was to keep control of my body. My movements were becoming even more erratic, though I was determined not to worry my family, so I tried to keep it to myself.
Stephen went home for Christmas after one term, and the symptoms that he had become too severe to hide from his parents. His father insisted on taking him to, I think, the family doctor first, and then that doctor recommended a specialist in London. So after Christmas, Stephen and his father went to London and St. Bartholomew's Hospital.
I was in hospital for 2 weeks and had a wide range of unpleasant tests. They took a muscle sample from my arm and stuck electrodes into me. Then they injected some liquid into my spine and took X-rays. Eventually, I was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, otherwise known as motor neuron disease or ALS. The prognosis was not good. I was given 2 to 3 years to live.
It was always hard to tell how Stephen took it, because for one thing, he wouldn't talk about it. You know, if you can't do anything about it, you probably don't want to talk about it or have people talk about it. He did seem pretty depressed, and I don't think he accepted it emotionally. The whole family went to pieces.
It was such a shock for everybody. My aunt turned white in the night, and we all thought he'd be, you know, he was not going to be able to live for very long.
Not knowing what was going to happen to me, or how rapidly the disease would progress, I was at a loose end. The doctors told me to go back to Cambridge and carry on with my research. But I was not making much progress, and anyway, I might not live long enough to finish my PhD. I felt somewhat of a tragic character. I took to listening to Wagner. Wagner's The Annunciation of Death made a great impression on me when I first heard it, as I had just developed motor neuron disease. I identified with it, and still do today. But as it turned out, I didn't die. At first the disease seemed to progress fairly rapidly. As time went by, however, it seemed to slow down. I also began to make progress with my work. But what really made the difference was falling in love with a girl called Jane Wilde, whom I had met about the same time I was diagnosed. This gave me something to live for.
Oh, he was great fun. He was eccentric. I was really drawn to his very wide smile and his beautiful grey eyes. And I think that's what made me fall in love with him. We were going to defy the disease, we were going to defy the doctors, and we were going to challenge the future.
Jane was beautiful and gentle, and seemingly undaunted by the harsh reality of my illness. Falling in love and getting engaged was the motivation that I needed. If I were to get married, I had to get a job, and to get a job I had to finish my PhD. I therefore started working hard for the first time in my life. To my surprise, I found I liked it.
Well, Stephen found his groove. He'd found his trajectory, and when Stephen finds a trajectory, he pursues it.
It was terribly exciting because he had been so depressed, and here he was with a new lease of life.
Perhaps because I realized I might not have much time, I renewed my efforts to tackle the big question in cosmology in the early 60s. Did the universe have a beginning, or not? Many scientists were instinctively opposed to the idea of a Big Bang, because it implies a moment of creation. The hand of God. For me, though, religion has no role to play in physics, so I wondered if the Big Bang could have happened on its own, without the need for a God to get it going. The key was in the theory of black holes. At the time, physicist Roger Penrose was working on what happens when a star collapses under the force of its own gravity. Penrose claimed the star would crush itself to a tiny point of infinite density, where even time itself would come to a stop.